Zariah stood frozen at the altar, her bouquet trembling so violently that petals fell, one by one, onto the white satin beneath her feet. The church had fallen into a suffocating silence, as if every breath had been stolen at once. And then, just as the minister prepared to unite two souls forever, the heavy doors creaked open. In walked a woman dressed in red, her eyes steady, her steps deliberate, her voice sharp enough to cut through the air. She wasn't a guest, nor a stranger. She was Sade. And what she carried in her hand was not a gift, not a blessing, but a box. A box that contained the kind of truth that doesn't just interrupt weddings, it destroys them. She stopped midway down the aisle, lifted her chin, and whispered words that turned the joyous ceremony into a gathering of fear. "Before you say, 'I do,'" she said, never looking away from the groom, "ask him what he's hiding." Gasps echoed through the pews. The choir fell silent. The mothers, seated proudly at the front, looked from one another in confusion, dread creeping into their eyes. Zariah's heart hammered inside her chest as she turned to Malachi, her groom, the man she thought she knew better than herself. But his face told a different story. His skin drained of color, his lips pressed tight, his hands clutching the ring like it was slipping from his grasp. Every second stretched longer than the last, every eye in the room demanding an answer. Was this jealousy? A stunt? Or had the foundation of their love been built on lies? And if so, why choose this moment, their wedding day in front of God, family, and community, to expose it? What happened inside that church that morning was not just a scandal. It was a fracture. A breaking apart of trust, of families, of reputations that had taken generations to build. By the time the truth spilled from Malachi's lips, nothing would ever be the same again. Neighbors who had come to celebrate love would leave in stunned silence, whispering only one question to one another: how long had this betrayal been waiting to be revealed? But here's the thing, Zariah wasn't the only one who had been deceived. What Sade held in her hands was more than evidence. It was the kind of secret that splits communities, ruins legacies, and forces people to face the kind of pain they've spent years denying. And it all unraveled in a single moment, in front of everyone who mattered most. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because today you're about to witness how one wedding, meant to unite two families, became a battlefield of lies, loyalty, and love turned to shame. Zariah grew up in a small southern town where everybody knew each other's name, and every Sunday the church pews filled before the choir even sang the first note. She was the kind of woman people spoke highly of, a teacher's daughter, raised with discipline, ambition, and a sense of responsibility that made her mother proud and her neighbors respectful. She worked at the local library, carried herself with dignity, and kept her circle small. For many, Zariah was the example of what a young woman should be: steady, caring, and unwilling to let the world define her worth. But in towns like hers, even the brightest stars don't shine without shadows waiting just beyond the light. People admired her, yes, but they also whispered, "She's too good for most men here. Whoever marries Zariah better come correct." Those whispers, carried through barbershops and porches, were less prophecy than warning. When Malachi entered her life, he seemed to fit the prophecy perfectly. He wasn't from her side of town, but he had the charisma that made him welcome in any room. He was tall, soft-spoken in public but full of laughter with friends, and he carried the kind of charm that turned heads wherever he went. His smile came easily, his compliments even easier. For Zariah, he seemed different from the men who had courted her before. He opened doors, remembered small details about her day, and spoke of a future bigger than the town they lived in. But behind the easy laughter and sharp suits, there were murmurs that Malachi's attention did not always stay fixed where it should. Some called it harmless flirtation, others called it trouble waiting to happen. And yet, Zariah saw in him a man who promised commitment, and she believed promises meant something. Tavian, Malachi's cousin, was not one to let promises blind him. He had grown up beside Malachi, envying the way his cousin always commanded attention and respect without much effort. Where Tavian worked hard and was often overlooked, Malachi seemed to succeed without trying. That envy twisted into resentment over the years. And when news spread that Malachi was courting Zariah, the woman many in town saw as untouchable, it only deepened Tavian's bitterness. He wouldn't voice it openly, but in his heart he thought, if Malachi stumbles, I'll be the one to tell the world he was never worthy of her. For Tavian, this wasn't about protecting Zariah, but about exposing his cousin's flaws. That hidden rivalry would later fuel the fire that consumed everything. Zariah's closest confidant was Nia, her childhood friend and the one person who dared to challenge her choices. Nia was sharp-tongued, quick to read people, and never afraid to say what others only thought. From the first moment Malachi appeared at Zariah's side, Nia carried a quiet suspicion. She noticed the way his eyes lingered too long on passing faces, the casual excuses when he failed to return calls, the charm that felt rehearsed rather than genuine. "Zariah, I know you love him," she once said, "but a man who shines too bright in the crowd often loses his way in the dark." Zariah brushed it aside, determined to believe in the future Malachi painted for her. Still, Nia's words hung in the air like a warning bell that only a true friend could ring. And then there was Elder Josiah, one of the oldest voices in the church and a man who had seen generations rise and fall within the town. He often spoke in proverbs that carried weight beyond their words. When asked about Malachi, he never offered direct judgment. Instead, he would shake his head slowly and say, "They say when the drum beats too loud, it's hiding something beneath the rhythm." For Zariah, it was just an elder's habit of speaking in riddles. For others, it was a reminder that sometimes noise is meant to distract from what lies beneath. Elder Josiah was not a man of gossip, but he understood that every story, no matter how sweet at the start, carries the risk of bitterness by the end. Yet, despite the murmurs and warnings, the romance between Zariah and Malachi blossomed. To the community, they appeared picture-perfect, attending Sunday service hand in hand, sharing meals with their families, laughing in the park as though nothing in the world could shake their bond. They took engagement photos under the town's oldest oak tree, a symbol of endurance, and invitations were soon sent across counties. Everyone prepared for what they believed would be the wedding of the year. But beneath the joy and celebration, small cracks had already begun to spread. The late-night calls Malachi silenced, the unexplained absences, the glances he quickly redirected when Zariah turned her head. Each moment was small enough to ignore, but together they built a foundation that was anything but steady. And it was only a matter of time before the truth broke through. In the months leading up to the wedding, Zariah began to notice the smallest things first. The phone calls that came late at night, answered quickly with a hushed tone before Malachi stepped outside, claiming it was business or family. At first, she brushed it off, convincing herself that every man had his private matters. But one evening, as she reached to hug him after a long day, she caught sight of something she could not ignore. A faint streak of lipstick on his shirt collar. It wasn't her shade. Her stomach dropped, her voice quivered, and she asked, "Malachi, what's this?" He laughed it off with ease, saying a coworker hugged him goodbye after a meeting, and Zariah, desperate to believe him, forced herself to smile and let it pass. Yet, the seed of doubt had been planted, and it grew quietly inside her. Not long after, Nia's suspicions found proof. One afternoon, while meeting a friend at a small cafe near the town's edge, she froze at the sight before her. Malachi was seated in the corner, leaning across the table toward a woman dressed boldly, her presence demanding attention. Her name was Sade. The two spoke in hushed tones, Malachi's hand brushing against hers as if no one in the world mattered but them. Nia stayed hidden, watching, her heart pounding. She knew Zariah needed to know, but she also knew how fragile hope could be. Later that night, she confronted Malachi quietly without Zariah present. "You think no one sees you, but I do," she told him. His reply was a smirk, not words, as if daring her to expose him. It was a dangerous game, one that would soon consume everyone involved. The whispers spread quickly after that. In beauty salons, over plates of fried catfish at the diner, and in the back pews of church, the story changed with every retelling but carried the same sting. Malachi's got a secret lover. Did you hear she might be pregnant? That man isn't ready to marry Zariah. The rumors became fuel for the fire, and in a town where everyone's business felt like communal property, it didn't take long before the gossip reached Zariah's ears. She asked her mother what to make of it, and her mother, wise and weary, gave her a look heavy with both love and warning. "Child, sometimes the man you love is the lesson you were sent to learn." Zariah wanted to reject those words, wanted to believe her mother was wrong, but they stayed with her like an echo she could not silence. Meanwhile, Tavian watched it all with quiet satisfaction. He noticed the late nights, the excuses, the rumors floating through town. Though part of him ached for Zariah, another part delighted in the chance to see his cousin's perfect image crumble. When Malachi bragged at family gatherings, Tavian would smirk and mutter under his breath, just loud enough for Zariah to hear, "Careful who you trust." When she asked him directly what he meant, he only shrugged, planting seeds without watering them. He wanted her to question Malachi, to look at him differently, to realize that Tavian had been right all along about his cousin's flaws. But what Tavian never admitted even to himself, was that envy guided his every move as much as any concern for Zariah's well-being. His bitterness made him a shadow in the story, waiting for the day he could step forward with proof. And so, while wedding invitations went out and Zariah smiled through bridal showers and dress fittings, the cracks beneath the surface deepened. She would try to celebrate, cutting cake samples, fitting her gown, talking about honeymoons, but always there were whispers trailing her steps. Someone would lean close and ask, "You sure about him?" Another would exchange knowing glances in her direction. Every joyful moment became tainted by the unspoken. At night, when she lay awake, she replayed her mother's words, her best friend's warnings, her cousin's hints. Still, she chose hope, telling herself that love demanded trust, and trust meant forgiveness. What she didn't know was that the box Sade held, the box she would bring into the church, already contained the evidence that would strip that hope away in the cruelest way possible. The morning of the wedding arrived with the kind of beauty that seemed almost scripted. The sun broke gently through stained glass windows, scattering colors across polished pews, while the scent of lilies drifted through the air. Guests filled the church in their best attire, some beaming with joy, others whispering quietly in corners. "Does she even know?" one woman murmured, her fan tapping against her palm. "That girl deserves better if the talk in this town is true." But still, the organ played, and the congregation rose to their feet as Zariah walked slowly down the aisle. She looked radiant, her gown flowing behind her like water, her eyes fixed on Malachi waiting at the altar. From a distance, everything appeared flawless. But if you looked closely, Malachi's hands trembled as he gripped the ring. His jaw was tight, his smile forced. Even before the vows, the weight of his secrets pressed down. The ceremony began, and the pastor's words filled the air with hope, faith, and promises of forever. Family members dabbed their eyes, overcome by the sight of two young souls about to be joined in holy matrimony. Yet, beneath the hymns and scripture, unease stirred. Zariah's mother sat stiffly in the front row, her eyes narrowing each time she glanced at Malachi. Nia shifted in her seat, biting her lip, remembering what she had seen at the cafe. Tavian leaned back in his chair with folded arms, the corner of his mouth curling, as though he already knew how this day would unfold. Then, just as the vows were about to be spoken, the church doors opened with a slow, heavy creak that silenced the room. Every head turned. A woman entered, clothed in striking red, a deliberate insult in a place where white symbolized purity. It was Sade. Her heels clicked against the tiled floor as she walked forward, unbothered by the stares or the whispers that followed. In her hand, she carried a small box, wrapped not in ribbon but in cold purpose. She did not rush, did not falter. Her gaze never left Malachi, whose face drained of color with each step she took. Gasps rippled through the congregation as recognition spread. "Lord have mercy," someone shouted. Others began to pray under their breath, clutching hands, fanning harder, as though faith itself could stop what was coming. Zariah froze at the altar, her fingers tightening around her bouquet until the stems bent beneath her grip. Sade stopped halfway down the aisle, raised her chin, and in a voice sharp enough to cut through the hymns she said, "Before you say, 'I do,' ask him what he's hiding." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Zariah turned to Malachi, her eyes wide, searching his face for denial, for reassurance, for anything at all. But his lips parted and closed without words, his throat dry, his ring trembling in his hand. The congregation leaned forward, eager and horrified. Sade lifted the lid of the box and revealed its contents. Inside were photographs, Malachi and Sade together, intimate moments frozen in time, undeniable evidence that trust had been broken long before this day. Beside the photos lay a sealed envelope. "If the pictures aren't enough," she said coldly, "open this. A DNA test doesn't lie." The sound of her words cracked through the church like thunder. Zariah's breath hitched, her bouquet slipped from her hands and petals scattered across the floor. Her veil slid from her head, drifting slowly as though innocence itself had just been stripped away. Chaos erupted. Mothers wept, fathers shouted, children cried, and the choir, once steady in song, now sat frozen in disbelief. Some guests covered their mouths, others pointed, unable to contain their shock. "How could he?" one woman sobbed. "That girl gave him everything." Zariah staggered backward, her body trembling, her heart breaking not just from the betrayal but from the humiliation of it all. Malachi reached out, whispering her name, but his stammering explanation only deepened the wound. He could not deny the photos. He could not silence the truth sealed in that envelope. Tavian, seated in the back, lowered his head and smiled faintly, a bitter satisfaction spreading across his face. Nia rushed forward to steady Zariah, whispering, "You don't deserve this. Don't let him break you." But Zariah's eyes were fixed on Malachi, as if searching for the man she thought she loved, and finding only a stranger. In that moment, the wedding was no longer a celebration. It was a courtroom, a battlefield, a reckoning. Every vow meant to bind them together was shattered before it could be spoken. Families hurled accusations across the pews, Malachi's kin defending him, Zariah's condemning him. The pastor stood silent, Bible still in hand, his voice lost against the storm of voices filling the sanctuary. And through it all, Sade stood tall in her red dress, the box at her side, her face unreadable. Some saw her as a destroyer, others as the bearer of truth, but to Zariah she was the woman who had taken everything from her in front of the people she loved most. As the cries echoed through the church and the weight of betrayal pressed down, one thing became clear: nothing about this day could be undone. And the life Zariah had dreamed of was gone before it ever began. The moment Zariah's veil touched the floor, she no longer belonged to that church aisle. Her steps echoed as she fled, gown trailing behind her, bouquet abandoned among the shattered silence. Outside, the air felt heavier than the wall she had just escaped. Tears stung her cheeks, but beneath the grief burned something deeper: resolve. She would not collapse in front of those who had gathered to see her broken. Inside, however, chaos thickened. Malachi's family turned on him, voices sharp with blame. His mother gripped his arm, whispering furiously, "You've shamed us all," while his brothers shook their heads, too embarrassed to defend him. The man who once commanded admiration now stood alone at the altar, empty-handed, exposed. Behind him, the box still lay open, evidence of his deception glaring back like an unblinking eye. The congregation that once clapped for his charm now glared in disappointment. Tavian wasted no time in seizing his moment. He leaned against the back pew, smirking with the satisfaction of a man who had been waiting for this downfall. In a low voice that still managed to cut across the room, he said, "I told y'all this day would come." His words stung Malachi like salt pressed into a wound, but to others it sounded like prophecy fulfilled. Whispers filled the church, each voice layering over the other until they became a storm. How could she forgive him now? That girl deserves better. This marriage would have been cursed from the start. Malachi tried to reach the door, but every step was blocked by disapproving stares. Even those who once praised his charisma now looked at him as if he were a stranger who had deceived them all. In their eyes he had not only betrayed Zariah, he had betrayed the community. And then came the elders, their voices rising above the chaos like a steady drumbeat of wisdom. Elder Josiah, who had lived long enough to see both love and betrayal wear their many faces, stood tall. His words carried the weight of generations. "When trust is broken at the altar," he declared, "the house built on it will never stand." His proverb echoed in the silence that followed, sinking deep into the hearts of those who listened. Some nodded solemnly, others wept, for they knew this truth too well. Marriage in their culture was not just a union of two, it was the binding of families, the weaving of trust, the promise of legacy. And now, all of it lay in ruins before it could even begin. The church was no longer a sanctuary of joy. It had become a courtroom where truth had been laid bare, and justice was being measured in shame. Sade, standing still in her red dress, felt the weight of 1,000 eyes on her. To some, she was the villain, heartless, cruel, a woman who had chosen the worst possible moment to wound another. To others, she was the truth-teller, the one bold enough to expose the lies no one else dared confront. But whichever role they cast her in, none could ignore her. Her presence had changed everything. The photographs and the DNA envelope were not rumors, they were reality. Yet her timing, the deliberate decision to reveal it in the middle of a sacred vow, made her both hated and unforgettable. Mothers shielded their daughters' eyes from her, whispering warnings about becoming a Sade. Men shook their heads, torn between despising her and silently acknowledging that without her, Malachi's deception would have marched unchecked into Zariah's life. Sade was both poison and cure, scorned and necessary. Meanwhile, Zariah stood at a crossroads. In the quiet of the churchyard, she felt the weight of dozens of eyes piercing her back. Some pitied her, others admired her courage to leave. But inside, her heart wrestled with a choice that would define her future. Would she crumble under the shame, becoming another whispered name in beauty shops and barber chairs, remembered only as the girl left at the altar? Or would she rise, carrying her dignity with her, proving that betrayal did not destroy her worth? Her mother's words from months ago came back like a haunting refrain. "Child, sometimes the man you love is the lesson you were sent to learn. And in that moment, Zariah realized the lesson had been delivered, painfully, publicly, but with clarity. She was wounded, yes, but not destroyed. The fire in her steps as she walked away carried the beginnings of a woman determined to rebuild. The churchyard grew silent as the last guests dispersed, their voices carried off like smoke in the evening air. Zariah sat alone on a wooden bench, her wedding gown heavy with the weight of what could have been. Her veil, torn and dirt-stained, lay in her lap. She picked at its edges absent-mindedly, eyes swollen but steady. For the first time all day she allowed herself to breathe. Inside her chest, grief warred with rage, and somewhere in between flickered a dangerous clarity. The world believed the scandal had ended the moment she fled that church. They thought the truth had been spilled, that the story was finished. But sitting there, veil slipping from her hands, she knew something everyone else did not. The wedding was never the end. It was the doorway into something far darker, something that reached beyond betrayal into the twisted roots of revenge. Her gaze drifted toward the small envelope that Sade had left behind, now tucked inside her purse. She hesitated at first, fingers trembling over the seal, knowing that whatever truth it contained would either crush her or free her. The church bells rang faintly in the distance, mocking the vows that had never been spoken. Slowly, carefully she tore it open. Inside lay the results of the DNA test that had silenced the church hours earlier. Her eyes scanned the words once, then twice. Her breath caught. It wasn't Malachi's child. The name written on that paper was Tavian's. The jealous cousin who had smirked through her pain, who had whispered predictions of Malachi's downfall, was not just a bystander. He was tangled in the very core of the scandal. Her hand shook as she clutched the paper, realization flooding her veins like fire. Zariah whispered into the night, her voice hoarse but sharp, each word slicing the silence around her. This wedding was never about love. It was about revenge. She closed her eyes, the betrayal layered deeper than even she had imagined. The man she trusted had betrayed her, but the man who pretended to protect her had deceived them all. As the moon cast its pale light across her gown, she understood the cost of every lie told and every truth buried. The story was no longer about a ruined marriage, it was about family secrets, bloodlines, and the revenge that had been orchestrated long before she ever walked down that aisle. And as the screen fades to black, one thing becomes undeniable. What the community thought ended in shame was only the beginning of a story that would unravel them all. Family, if this story kept your heart racing, don't walk away without joining ours. You've sat with Zariah in her sorrow, you've witnessed Malachi's shame, and you've felt the sting of betrayal ripple through an entire community. Stories like this remind us of an old saying: when the drumbeat changes, the dancers must also change their steps. And here, the rhythm of truth changed everything. So if you want to walk with us through the next scandal, the next heartbreak, the next lesson life has to teach, go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now. Because trust me, another story is coming, and you will not want to miss it. Now let me ask you, what would you have done if you were Zariah? Would you have stood and fought right there at the altar, or would you have walked away, veil torn but dignity intact? Your voice matters here. Share your heart in the comments below and let us know. And if you're still listening with us right now, still walking this road after all the twists and turns, drop a red heart in the comments so I know my people are here with me tonight. This isn't just a story, it's a family gathering, a circle of truth tellers, and your presence is what keeps it alive.